Hey everyone, welcome to class 6 of manual software testing training. In this class, we are going to discuss about test development process and test design techniques. So let's understand about the test development process, what actually happens within it, and some of the key terms that might be confusing, and based on my experience and my understanding, what exactly is actually used in the industry for those specific terms and what I have been using and doing for those specific terms. We'll be discussing all of that. So the first thing that I want to clarify now is the test development process and some of the terms that you might be confused about. For example, what exactly is test conditions, what are test procedures, or basically the test scenarios, right? And then what are test cases? Okay, now test conditions and test procedures, test scenarios, these are the most confusing terms out there, and I have also gone through a lot of articles, and everywhere you'll find a different information. So what I'll be covering here is what I have been doing from past 20 years in terms of how actually test scenarios, conditions exactly are being used, and how you will be using in the real projects. Now, do not, as the software tester, if you just stick to these terminologies and try to find right and wrong there, that's not what you actually do in the project, right? So basic understanding and what exactly needs to be done in each of these terminologies, that is good enough, right? So let's quickly go ahead and see what exactly is the test development process. So when we say test development process, it is basically what all process or the approach that you are going to follow step by step to design, develop your test case and to go ahead and then move to the execution phase, right? So that's the basic test development process, and within that process, you will need a lot of information to go ahead and start documenting test cases, right? So that's what it is saying. It is important to know what you're trying to test, inputs and expected outcome before you actually start test execution, right? So this is what all is required into the test development process. What you're trying to test, what will be the inputs, and what are you expecting out of that test, right? So if you need that information or how to gather that information, that's what we are going to discuss. And then how you are going to develop your test cases, right? Design your test cases. So first term is test conditions. All right. Now when we say test conditions, it is documented in test design specification, and this is very relevant from the ISTQB syllabus. Okay. So these are the definitions from ISTQB syllabus itself, and test condition as per ISTQB is basically an item or event of a component or system that could be verified by one or more test cases. Okay, it could be one test case or more test cases. Now, yeah, definition is okay. Did it make sense to you, right? Absolutely. I mean, just by reading this without any example, it's not going to make sense to you, right? So when we say test condition with an example, a test condition is, say for example, you are testing a login functionality, right? Now login functionality itself can have multiple conditions. A condition with valid username and valid password, right? That should go through. A condition, test condition with valid username and an invalid password, right? So in this particular case, when we say condition, it is something that can be verified. Okay, so valid username and valid password you can verify. Yeah, if I put this, it will be logging me in through to the home page, right? So it could be one test case or could be multiple test cases, right? So it can be a combination of multiple test cases to test that condition, right? That's a separate story. But a condition is something that can be verified. For example, valid username, valid password can be verified. Invalid username and invalid password verified, right? Valid username, invalid password, that's another condition. So anything testable, right? Anything that can be verified in the functionality quality attribute is a condition, right? Now in the real projects, I highly doubt that you'll be using test condition, right? Mostly you'll be using what? You'll be using the test scenarios, okay, which is also known as test procedure as per ISTQB syllabus. So the second term, it is a test scenario, okay? So the second term, when we say test scenario or test procedure, okay, that is what most of you in the projects will be using the terms when you go ahead and start designing your test cases. When we say test scenarios, what exactly is a test scenario, right? So test scenario or a test procedure document is a document that specifies the actions or the sequence of actions for a particular test, right? So when we say test scenario, it is something which will tie up. So for example, test condition is just login, valid username and password, right? When we say test scenario for the same login functionality, right? So test scenario will be not just that condition, but a complete scenario for a valid, say for example, valid login, a valid user with valid username and password should be able to log in successfully and redirect it to home page, okay, and see all of these details. Invalid user or a user with invalid username and password should not be redirected to this, should be displayed this error, right? So it's a combination of sequence of actions, right? So these one-liners that we write as test scenarios are kind of a sequence of multiple steps there, right? So see multiple conditions that are being basically added to form that sequence, right? And that is where these terms become really confusing. Test condition and test scenario, they are highly overlapping, and if you try to get into details of this and just argue on that, that's not going to help, right? Practically, just understand that with an example, yeah, condition is something, a little thing that can be verified, okay? A scenario is something which is a combination of multiple conditions, could be, right? Or a whole sequence of action that will make sense as an end user perspective. That's what the scenario is, right? Or procedure that will actually make sense from end user's perspective, okay? A condition won't make sense from end user's perspective, okay? That's the fine difference between the condition and the procedure or scenario, okay? So test procedures, I don't use it. I haven't seen people in my whole career using test procedures term. It's there in ISTQB syllabus. If you're appearing for the exam, you might come across it. Obviously you have to prepare for it. But yes, test condition some people use, but most of the time we end up doing the test scenarios, okay, which is the sequence of steps, or basically the user scenarios that we say. We document that as one-liners, and then we elaborate them as, you know, a sequence of test cases that can be basically elaborated as test cases to test that whole scenario, right? Because the whole scenario can be a combination of multiple test cases to be added there, right? So that's what the second point is. So a document specifying a sequence of actions for the execution of a test, right? So sequence of actions that is specified, right? So there is no specific document as such that is utilized in the real projects, but if there is a formality required in the project, there can be a test procedure or test scenario document that yes, we are going to document all the scenarios here, all the conditions here in this document, and all the test cases. Anyways, we have the document or the tools to document the test cases, right? Now, test scenario is, as per ISTQB, is also known as test script or manual test script, right? Now, that's another layer of confusion to it, okay? So if you say it is a test script, right, and then people start confusing test script with the test cases, right? So just think about with the second point here, test procedure, test scenario, test script or manual test script is all same as per ISTQB. Okay. So to put it simple, don't get confused. Test condition, take an example of it. Okay. It's a thing that can be verified. A test scenario from end user's perspective, a whole sequence of actions that can be basically formulated to test a particular functionality. All right. Or that is also known as a script, because a script is a sequence of actions, right? Or sequence of steps that can be formulated. Then comes the test case, right? So once you have the scenario, then comes the test case, which is nothing but a set of input values, steps, execution preconditions, and then the steps, expected results, right? So all of that is basically documented into the document, which is test case, right? And test scenario can be a combination of multiple test cases, right? It will most of the time will be combination of multiple test cases together, and that will form the whole scenario. So if I talk practically how usually in projects this whole thing ties up, okay? So in project, if you're following agile, you will get all the requirements as the user stories. From there, people don't go ahead and write different test conditions separately, okay? Test conditions are taken care internally as part of the scenario, test scenario definition itself or test scenario documentation itself, right? Because otherwise you will just end up documenting everything. So test scenario ensure that your conditions are by default inherent or covered in there, right? Now from those test scenarios, then the teams start elaborating the test cases and ensuring that yes, the scenario covers basically, or adding the test cases if there are existing test cases. For example, they will add those test cases and formulate the step-by-step sequence to test that particular user scenario. Okay, so this is basically about test condition, procedure or test scenario, test procedure or test scenario, right? So, and then test cases. So this is overall the definition as per ISTQB, as per my experience, as per how actually it is used in the projects, right? So what actually it will be used, focus more on that, because definitions won't help you to basically, actually go ahead and formulate and test, right? But from ISTQB perspective, I have covered all of these concepts just to ensure that if you're going for ISTQB exam, you are clear on that. Okay, so a little bit long video, a long lecture on this single slide. Now let's go further with the next. Now, when we talk about the formality of test documentation, okay, so how formal the test documentation will be. So for example, previously we have saw that we have test condition or test scenarios are documented into test procedure document, right? Or test cases are documented. So what is the level of formality when the team is documenting any of these, right? So this depends on the requirement from the client or the requirement from the, for example, there is a regulatory compliance or regulations that you definitely need to follow these, this level of documentation. Then in that case, obviously you will be having more formality or more level of documentation available. So testing can be performed with varied level of formality. It could be very formal, very informal, or could be very formal. So very informal with minimal documentation, or with very formal which is intensive documentation. Now where it could be very informal, say for example you are testing any of the mobile app which is not very life critical or doesn't require a lot of compliance requirement, right? And though in that sort of case the formality can be less. Okay, but if you're testing an airplane application, the software application, then definitely there is a lot of regulatory requirements, there is a lot of other things that need to be managed and maintained. So formality of the test documentation will be high in those sort of scenarios. Okay, any application for banking, right? Security, right? So banking security needs to be the key part of it. So in that particular case, yes, formality needs to be more, right? Because you need to be compliant with all of the security or payment card industry. For example, you are testing the cards application or transactions, so it needs to be PCI compliant, right? So depends on the level of or which particular application you are testing. Now right level of formality depends on the context of testing, which is basically what I have just explained. So commercial safety critical application needs more formal approach as compared to any, say for example, my personal blog, right? No formality is required in that. So level of formality is also influenced by organization, culture, maturity of the development and testing process, right? So how mature the testing process is, how in depth the organization wants to follow the formality, right? So that also guides what level of formal documentation needs to be there. Does all the test cases need to be documented in detail, step by step, with all the required information, or all the test scenarios need to be documented and available in the tool all the time, right? So depends on the maturity of the organization, the requirement of the client, right? Or the context of the application where you are testing. So now what we'll do in this session, we'll cover the formal approach to the test documentation. Now in real projects, you won't be doing all of the discussions or all of the documentation, or you won't be using all of the terms that we have discussed till now or we'll be discussing later, right? So we'll discuss the formal approach. So whatever is required in your project, you will be using it. Whatever is not, you will be not using it, right? But you will be aware that yes, if required, we can document these sort of things as well in our projects. Okay. Now test development process consists of three main phases. Okay. When we say test development process, it consists of analysis, test design, and test implementation. Three important phases that are very important from interview point of view as well. When somebody asks what are the key test development processes, what are different phases of test development process? Test analysis, design, and implementation. Okay. So when we say analysis, which is basically identifying the test conditions, right? Now there won't be, so in real projects, as I mentioned, you won't be having a identification of test condition, a separate phase altogether. Okay, you will be mostly, analyzing and then going through the scenarios directly. Okay, let's understand formally what exactly analysis or identifying test condition is all about. So in test conditions, what we do, we identify the testable areas. Okay, so what can be verified in login functionality? Okay, what can be verified in registration functionality? Okay, so that is what analyzing that in particular functionality and then looking at whatever is available. So when we say test basis, it is basically, it could be requirement, existing system, whichever can guide you to write the test cases. So when you have the requirements, you go through the requirement and based on the requirement, you come up and derive the test information, right? Or conditions. And then test basis is anything, for example, requirement, SRS, design, document, code. So anything that you refer to for writing the test cases is your test basis. And this is very common practice in real projects. Okay, you will definitely be referring to the requirement, you will be referring to the design document, to the existing system, to the business processes. Code, not necessarily. Okay, but in case you are required, yes, you might refer to that, right? But very commonly the requirement, design and business process documentation, definitely you'll be referring to come up with the test conditions. Okay, and then in test analysis, you find what could be tested or test conditions and then you document those. Right, now as I mentioned that you won't be having separate phase for test conditions, you'll be combining it with the test scenarios. But if there is a separate phase, if there is a formality need to be there in the project, yes, you will go ahead and document, for example, login functionality. So I'll go ahead and document login, valid username and password, login, valid username, invalid password. Each of these are conditions, right? Now when these conditions are combined further, say for example, valid username and password, then user should be redirected to the home page, right? So whenever you combine this, or what will be the error response, that is mostly like kind of scenario. So there is very fine line between condition and scenario. All right, when we say scenario, it's more from the end user's perspective and might be a more elaborated approach or more further approach as it is in the conditions, test conditions, right? So that's where the confusion arises, and that's where most of the time you will be doing both of these phases in just one. Okay, so chosen test condition, depending on the test strategy or detailed test approach, they might be based on the risk, model, likely failure, compliance, right? So any of these can be basically the criteria to choose the test conditions. Then these are converted into the detailed test cases, right? And then different test design techniques are used to figure out good set of test cases. All right, now when we say test, you have identified test condition, right? Now test conditions get converted into the test cases. Okay, so you can directly convert test condition into test cases. Now when we say test scenario, that's where test scenarios could be, multiple test cases tied up together, and that's why it is called manual test script, because you just testing a test condition won't fulfill the end user needs. End user will do multiple actions, right? So end user will log in. After logging in, they'll navigate to some other page and try to do some certain actions, and that's what comes into the scenario, right? So once you have written test condition, you will then go ahead, write the test cases, and then basically the test scenarios. But because test condition scenarios are mostly done together, so you do that together and then go to the test case documentation. That's practical approach. Okay, that's how you will be doing. But in case there is a lot of formality, you will go ahead with the conditions first, then you will elaborate those conditions into the test cases. All right, you will do that, and then in the test scenarios, what you will do, you will again write test scenario. Okay, and then you will add each of these test cases to make the whole script to follow that user scenario. Okay, which is kind of, personally I feel it is a weird sort of approach, right? If practically you think, I have identified condition, right? Let me think about from the end user's perspective. That's the value that will be there in terms of testing, right? So I'll think from the end user's perspective, and then I'll I'll come up with the scenario, test scenario. Okay, that's what usually most of the projects do, right? Because that makes more sense. So I'll come with the user scenarios, right? Test scenarios. And based on those test scenarios by default will contain all the conditions, because each of these conditions will be fulfilled by default into the scenarios. You have to take care of these conditions within the scenarios, and then you go ahead and elaborate those into the test cases. Now with those scenarios, try to segregate the common test cases that can be segregated. For example, login test case, valid login test case. You can separate that out and you can just use that login test case wherever you want to further go ahead with the test scenarios, right? For example, valid user logs in, and then after that you are testing some more functionality in the home page. So you can reuse that test case, login test case again, and that's where this test scenario will help you to basically achieve. So for example, there are common test case, you just pull those, okay, and use those to further test it. Right. So I hope this was clear. So this is more of the formal approach, and if there is a lot of formality, that you will be going through the test condition and separately documenting test condition in a document. Right. Now what there's also needs to be done in formal, very formal test approaches, that test condition should be able to be linked back to the source documentation. Okay, whatever source documentation you have referred to identify traceability and requirements coverage. So with the very formal approach, what you are doing is, there is a requirement, okay, then you write the test conditions for each of these requirement, all right, and then these conditions need to be linked back to the requirement, so that you know that these conditions are linked to this particular requirement, right? So that's also very important. Now the next phase is design phase, which is specifying the test case, all right, and the third phase is implementation, which is specifying test procedure or scripts, all right. So this is very formal approach, and in this here you will see that the third phase is the test scenario phase. Okay, so we'll discuss if you are following very formal approach, this will come third. Now the first was the conditions, the second is the design, wherein you specify the test cases. You, based on those conditions, you define the test cases or you elaborate the steps. So during test design phase, you create test cases. You need to be very specific what exactly input conditions are, what will be the preconditions, what will be the test outcomes, right? So all of that needs to be specified in the test design phase, because you are actually writing the test cases with step 1, step 2, user should do this, then what will happen? User clicks on this link, what will happen? User opens this page, enters this data, so test data needs to be there, what happens, right? So input values, test condition, preconditions, expected results, all of these need to be clear. Expected results should be defined prior to execution, right? And test cases are prioritized to ensure high priority test cases, okay? And test cases need to be detailed. In very formal approaches, they need to be very detailed. Now third come implementations, which is basically specifying test procedures or scripts. When we say test procedures or script, what exactly it is? It is the test scenario, right? So ideally, practically, condition and scenario go hand in hand, and then we go ahead and do the test cases, okay? But in very formal approaches, you go ahead with the test conditions, then you document all the test cases based on those test conditions, and then come up with the scenarios, okay? This is confusing and not highly efficient. I haven't found this a very highly efficient approach. It is very good for formal testing processes, okay? Very good for formal testing processes. If you go ahead with the test conditions first, then document test cases, which is third step as a second step for each of these test conditions, and then you go ahead and think, yeah, what I am going to test in terms of end user scenarios, right? So it might work, but even in the formal approaches, okay, even in the formal approaches, my personal recommendation would be to come up with the test condition, okay, that's fine, document it, and then hand in hand, as with test condition, keep an eye on the end user scenarios as well for the similar functionality. That will give you a clear indication of each condition, what end user might do with that, right? So you will come with the test scenarios as well, and then you go ahead, document test cases, and then when test cases are ready in your test scenarios, you just add those test cases as 1, 2, 3, 4, that these four test cases are required to fulfill this test scenario, okay? Now in the formal approach, what they are suggesting is that go ahead with the test condition, condition, and this is per ISTQB. They go ahead with the test condition, then go ahead with the test cases. Okay, elaborate each of the condition with the test cases, and then third step, we are going ahead with the test scenario. So what exactly is the third phase? Third phase is the test implementation, or basically defining the test scenario or procedure or script. Okay, all of them are synonyms, right? So when we say test implementation, in test implementation, the test cases are grouped into test suites and ordered into proper sequence. Okay. Now, if you are doing a testing and a lot of formality, this is exactly what you are going to do. In Agile, the sequence will be different. Condition and scenario will be together. You'll be thinking together, and then you will be documenting elaborating the test cases as a second step. Okay. That's the practical approach. But in the formal approach, this is the third step that we are discussing here. So you go ahead and you order your test cases in a proper sequence based on the test scenario that you have thought about now, right? After doing the conditions, now when you are doing conditions, you are basically just touching a little functionality and documenting, very little aspect of it to test that. Yes, login functionality. You are not thinking broader sense in that particular phase. Now you started thinking in a broader or end user's perspective phase in the test implementation phase, right? So there is a little bit of gap there. But if there is a formal approach to be followed, this is what you are going to do. So during test implementation, you also specify the test procedure. All right. And test procedure is a document which specifies the steps to be taken in running a set of test case, which is basically test scenario, right? So test procedure or scenario. Test procedures are then formed into test execution schedule or superscript, which specifies which procedure are to be run when and by whom. Okay. So this is a formal approach. To keep it very simple and short, in the real projects, test condition and scenarios will be working together. You know the difference about the condition and scenario now, and then you will elaborate the test cases. Once you have the test cases, right, then your scenarios will be basically more of easy to go ahead and execute those, right? So based on the scenarios, you will be then documenting your test cases and reusing the test cases that are common across those scenarios. All right, makes sense? So now let's go ahead and discuss about the test design technique categories. Okay, how you are going to design your test cases exactly, right? So there are 3 categories to design the test. When we say test designing techniques, they are really important because you can't test every possible combination in testing, right? Every possible combination cannot be tested. So in that particular case, you need to know the techniques that you will be using in order to formulate your test cases, right? In order to formulate your test cases, you need to basically know what techniques you are going to apply so that with minimal effort, you get the maximum test coverage. Okay, so for that, these 3 categories are there. First is specification based or black box testing techniques. Okay, then the second one is structured based or white box testing techniques, and third is experience based testing techniques. Okay, so any one of these can be applied to design the test cases, right? And this is as per the ISTQB as well, so it will help you in the ISTQB certification preparation as well. Now when we talk about the specification based or black box testing technique, okay, so specification based, also known as black box, it is a dynamic testing technique. Okay, and it is input output driven. So you are not concerned what happens inside the software. That's why it is known as black box. Inside what happens, you don't know. Like you're driving the car. Are you bothered about while you are driving the car or testing or doing the test drive of the car? What happens within the engine? You are not bothered about it, right? So same way, with the software, once you are using the application, you are trying to test drive the application basically. Say for example, you're not bothered how the functions and methods are being called internally, right? So that's what the test design, black box test design technique is. Now in this technique, tester is concerned about what software does and not how it does. Okay, just what it does, not how. Okay, like how everything happens within the car engine, I'm not bothered. I'm just test driving. I'm enjoying the drive. If it is smooth, it's good. Okay. Then in black box testing techniques, right, you test both functional and non-functional characteristics of the software using this technique. Now the diagram here, same thing, right? So this is anything within the software is a black box. You are not concerned what is happening within the box. You just provide the input and you check if the output is as per the actual, actual output is as per the expected, then your test is pass, right? Now, the second thing is structured based or white box testing technique. What happens there? Now, this is also known as glass box or white box. Why? Because you can, as a tester, you have the visibility how the code is basically traversed when something is being tested, right? So it is also a dynamic testing technique, and it tests the internal software structure, and it tests how the decision conditions, everything within the code, how it is basically exercised, right? Have all the conditions been exercised, have all the statements being exercised with the different test cases that you are doing, have the loops been exercised, right? So when you go ahead to that detail internally to see that all the relevant modules and the statements of the code have been exercised, then that is what white box testing. And white box testing requires the knowledge of the internal code and good programming skills as well. Okay, we'll discuss more about white box testing, but briefly, this is basically what white box testing is. So you can see this flowchart here. So how white box testing will be usually done. So for example, if you're aware of with any programming language, say for example, there is a method written in Java or Python, so that accepts two values and returns if the values or the sum is greater than 10, it will return something. If it is less than 10, it will return something, right? So some logic has been written, right, which is depicted by this flowchart. So read two values, and then if that Z value or the sum is less than 10, then it will say, okay, less than 10. If Z is less than 10, then if it is true, go ahead and print this, okay, print Z, whatever the value is, and then end, right? So basically this comes and ends. If it is, not less than 10, then directly ends, right? So basically just a very simple flowchart to depict that. So if you are testing any of these internal logic in the code and making sure that your tests are passing the relevant values so that both of these paths are being exercised, right? Then you are ensuring that yes, if both paths are being exercised and you have visibility that yes, with this value I have tested this, with this value it has taken this path and it hasn't printed anything, then you are actually going ahead and doing white box testing. All right. Now, experience-based testing technique. So it is based on the experience or knowledge of the person, tester, developers, whosoever users, stakeholders to design the test conditions or test cases or test scenarios. And experiences of both technical and business people are considered in this case. It is not just that testers, it is basically the team's experience is being utilized to design the test cases. And because of the prior experience, people know where things can go wrong, right? For example, I've been into the banking for a while, okay? Now, if based on my experience, I have worked on different domains in the banking, right? Onboarding, transactions, after transactions, what happens. So if, say, for example, there is a similar sort of application being built based on the experience where things could have gone wrong or the things that are complex or modules that are complex, I now know that with my experience, I can provide or input or put more effort or details into the areas that might be risky based on my past experience, right? So that's what the experience-based technique is all about. Now, where to apply different categories of testing techniques. So specification based or black box testing techniques are used at all levels of testing, right? It is not that it is only at specific level. So it is component through to acceptance, right? It can be applied on requirement design doc. So basically you can do at any level. White box testing can also be applied at all different levels. Okay. Component through to acceptance. So unit integration system acceptance. So at all levels you can apply any of these techniques, right? And then experience based is also used when there is inadequate or no documentation for designing test cases and useful for less risk applications or under extreme time pressure. And experience based techniques also leads to exploratory testing, okay, which is another testing type wherein your experience leads to that, to explore the application more, and then as and when the testing goes along, you then start documenting different scenarios based on the exploration of the application. So this is where the different categories of testing techniques can be applied. Now, this is another continuation, basically test design techniques in detail. So how are you going to design the test cases, right? So when we say specification based or black box test design technique, so what all tricks we are going to use to design the test cases exactly. For example, equivalence, partitioning, boundary value analysis, and how we are going to apply these techniques. This is what we are going to learn in the next class. All right. So that's all for this particular class. I hope you got good enough information from this particular class. Please do comment if there are any doubts or things that I haven't been able to clear. I've tried my best, but in case there are few things that are not clear, please do comment, and positive, negative, whatever it is, I'm happy to hear that things haven't been clear to you or very clear to you. If not, I'll try to create another video to clarify all the doubts that for the things that haven't been clear in this particular class. So in the next class, I'll discuss about the equivalence, partitioning, black box test design techniques, boundary value analysis, how you're going to utilize to design your test cases. So that's all for this class. I hope this was helpful. Thank you very much for watching.